The president-elect and the vice president-elect both visited the UN that winter, but a Senate committee was already there, and it was looking for communists.
There was a all-pervasive fear that ran through everything, and I found it in my family for sure.
In 1952, Dr. Caroline Feller Bauer was simply 17-year-old Caroline Feller, high school senior. Her father worked at the UN, and the McCarran probe of the United Nations would make a significant difference in her life.
My father was never under any kind of suspicion whatsoever, but he wanted to save that which he felt strongly about, which at the time was the United Nations.
Abraham Feller had spent much of his life in public service. Right then, he was top lawyer at the United Nations and counsel to Trygve Lie, the Secretary General of the UN. Feller firmly believed the UN was the world's best hope for peace, and although he was not under suspicion, when the McCarran investigation triggered firings of some of the U.S. workers there, Feller was devastated.
We were going on a shopping trip the next day to buy some long gloves to go with an evening dress for a dance. And when I got to the apartment house, the elevator man said, "I'm sorry for what happened." I didn't even know what he was talking about. Got up to my door, and I heard voices behind the door when I knew there shouldn't be voices. And the entire apartment was filled with friends of my father. And of course they had sent someone out to find me, but couldn't. And I heard that my father had died, and indeed had killed himself.
Abraham Feller had torn himself away from his wife's grasp and jumped out of a 12th-story window in his New York City apartment. He had been accused of nothing, suspected of no communist affiliations. But his job, defending American employees at the UN from accusations against them, that job put such a strain on Feller that he simply cracked. Come back to Christmas Eve, 1952, and some French sailors who ran afoul of the Grinch.
Our world continues. Fear and frustration in the winter of '52.
Oh, wheel of fortune.
Our world will continue, but first, some other memories from the winter of '52.
Let me know the magic of a kiss and a sigh while the wheel is spinning, spinning, spinning. I'll not dream of winning fortune or fame while the wheel is turning, turning, turning. I'll be yearning, yearning for love's precious flame.
Welcome back to the winter of 1952. The fear of communist military aggression and the determination to hold the line against it continues in Korea. The enemy there is visible, clearly defined. In this country, the fear of communist subversion continues to flourish. But how do you fight an enemy who wears no uniform? How do you tell a spy from a communist sympathizer, a fellow traveler, an idealist, or a frustrated loyal American who simply believes that he shouldn't have to prove that loyalty by swearing to it? In the winter of 1952, the answer seems to be bag 'em all.
And once you've got them, if you can, kick them out of the country. Then make sure not to let any more of them in. Which brings us to the President, the Congress, and the nation of immigrants. And that brings us to the McCarran-Walter Act. It would revise our immigration laws. Congress had passed it back in June. In many ways, it was a fine bill. For example, it removed race as a barrier to becoming a U.S. citizen. But then it added new rules. Rules allowing the government to keep out any immigrant and deport any naturalized citizen if the government decided that person was subversive. Due process was not mentioned. Many Americans believed this was unconstitutional. One of them was President Harry Truman. He vetoed the bill. But Congress, certain the majority of Americans agreed with the proposed changes, voted to override the veto. President Truman then appointed a commission which reported back to him that the bill was an arrogant and brazen instrument of discrimination. But it didn't matter. It was too late. On the day before Christmas, 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act became law. I don't know how Representative Francis Walter felt that Christmas Eve, but Senator Pat McCarran was one happy fella.
That is one of the most salutary pieces of legislation that has ever been enacted in the United States for the internal security of the United States.
Walter Judd of Minnesota was a Republican congressman and colleague of the bill's co-sponsor in the House, Francis Walter.
Francis Walter was highly respected. Francis Walter didn't go along with that so-called anti-communist stuff in the beginning, but when he studied the thing carefully, he came out convinced that there were serious threats to our own security from persons who had communist sympathies and who were applying for or being naturalized under the previous laws.
The Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, gateway to America, they have always been, properly, symbols of hope. But there was always a little fear here, too, of the unknown, and frustration at bureaucratic red tape, and sorrow at family left behind in the old country. The McCarran-Walter Act magnified those apprehensions. It broadened the grounds on which foreigners already legally here could be deported, and not just immigrants, but temporary visitors, students, tourists, could be denied entry if their presence here was deemed to be prejudicial to the best interests of the United States. And it didn't much matter who did the deeming. Sam Burnson worked for the Immigration Service, screening prospective immigrants on Ellis Island.
One of the things that would happen every so often is that someone would make an accusation against the person coming in and say he was a communist. That was the kiss of death, because that person would be on Ellis Island for years. They could be excluded without any hearing, no representation by counsel, no statement of the charges.
Felix Kuzman, born in Estonia, had lived legally in the United States for more than 20 years without ever becoming a citizen. That hurt him.
Special attempts would be made against people who are not citizens.
Kuzman's wife fared little better, and she was born in this country. When her husband was suspected of having communist connections, Helen Kuzman shared the harassment.
They did this by frequent visits from the FBI, who would visit at home, attempt to talk with us. Numerous phone calls. People would follow us when we were in the car. We were followed sometimes. They would use all kinds of subterfuges. They used the subterfuge of calling me at work and telling me they were investigating my mother's credit rating. Actually, my mother had been dead over 4 years.
When Uncle Sam pointed his finger, even the mighty trembled. Charlie Chaplin, a subject of Britain, was overseas plugging his new movie Limelight that winter. He chose to remain in Europe rather than face a rising furor in this country over his alleged communist sympathies. His American wife, Una, came back alone to put their affairs in order. You knew there was a climate of fear when our propaganda told us there was nothing to be afraid of. One classroom film featured this Thanksgiving Day message.
For knowing that a knock on our door means nothing to fear. It's not going to be some political gangster coming to drag one of us off to jail because we believe in freedom.
Oh? It was night. They were at home. Stanley Novak was accused of being sympathetic to communism. He was a naturalized American citizen. However, his wife and daughter, both of them were born here.
Our family was gathered for Christmas Eve celebration. The bell rang, and our daughter Lisa ran to the door, expecting a package or maybe some member of the family who had not arrived yet, and she found a man there asking for her father. So when Stanley went to the door, the man handed him a paper and announcing that civil proceedings were initiated against him to revoke his citizenship